with Mike Paletta and Sanjay. Yoshi? Joshi.
Yeah. Yoshi's the guy on Mario.
I think it's the Spanish.
No, it's Super Mario.
The Spanish would have called me Hoshi.
Hoshi, that's right.
And the Japanese would call me Yoshi.
No,
Yoshi.
True story. We have a friend.
Europeans do the same thing.
It couldn't be any simpler, really.
Europeans do that.
No, we have a friend.
Yeah.
We have a friend, Dr. Mike Fontana. The first time
You're not Swedish, are you?
No. First time I introduced him to Sanjay, he thought his name was Frito. He thought he was Spanish. Frito.
Where did that come from?
I'm just telling you the true story. He told me this story like 2 years ago, and I just started laughing. I didn't know that either. He didn't pay attention to it when I introduced you to him. That's probably 25 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's really sad. Like, I've known you for years and years, and I always avoid saying your last name because I'm afraid of saying it wrong.
I'm like, just say it like it's
Say it spelled. Okay, it's like my name, same thing.
Just call Sanjay Paletta, and you're covered.
People always add an N to my name. Like, it's Sprandio, just like it's spelled, but there's always an extra N, like 90% of the time, Sprandino. So I'm like, yeah, that's right. It's
close. You don't get upset.
But anyway, we just finished talking about COVID and your experiences during COVID. But one of the other topics that we wanted to talk about was, where you guys think the hobby's going. It's changed a lot over the last year. We've had a ton of new people coming in. People who got out are back in, which is amazing. But unfortunately, the aquarium party might be coming to an end a little bit because people have to go back to work, and now people are spending more time with their families, traveling. And obviously, these things compete for your time. You were actually saying, too, just the guilt level.
Right.
During COVID, you spent a lot of time with your wife, so...
Feel less guilty.
Less guilty.
Yeah, less guilt
because the tank, too.
Yeah, you didn't have to sneak down at 11 o'clock to go work on your tank after your wife went to bed. You could say, honey, I'm going downstairs for an hour, and 3 hours later, you come back up.
She was happy that you were gone.
Yeah.
After spending the whole day with you.
You've gone over everything that was on the internet and all the insanity there. And I mean, my wife and his wife are both very patient with us. After all these years with the tanks, they know at times we have to spend time on the tanks, but we didn't feel quite as guilty. I know I didn't, I know he didn't, probably most of the people didn't.
Most people didn't, I think.
So there you have it. I mean, if you have a spouse who knows that you have to spend time on the tank, then you might be in pretty good shape. But if you're not, now you're competing that. So we might see some people, just for their sheer changes in life, kind of exit out who have come back in or who have started. But I think there's also a kind of staying power with aquariums, which might also benefit us over the long run.
Yeah, we as we were discussing, there's a lot of returns on dogs and cats, but there isn't a lot of, you can't really return a fish or a tank or a coral for the most part. So in that context, and if they did their job right while they set up their tank, they have to spend some time, but not an infinite amount of time like when you start things up. The most time you spend with the tank is planning ahead to set it up, and then for the first probably 2 or 3 months once it is set up, to get it running and make sure everything's going. As we discussed before, a lot of the time we spent during COVID was kind of on extraneous or extra things that we hadn't done in the past to try and make it simpler, less expensive, and more fun to do. And if you did that right during COVID, hopefully your tank is requiring less time. I know mine is actually requiring less time because I've made things simpler to do and easier to do, which is, as well as I planned it, I didn't do that. And also that your wife knows or your spouse knows to expect that you have to spend some time on the tank. The problem a lot of hobbyists get into is they think it's a television set where you just turn it on, you look at it, and you don't really worry about it. And a reef tank is not that. You don't have to spend your time with your hands in the tank all the time, but you do have to spend some time. You have to do some testing, you have to do water changes, obviously you have to feed the fish. If corals are growing profusely in the tank, you have to trim them. All those things are time consuming, but they're not bad. And nobody enjoys doing maintenance, let's be honest. Right. So
it's kind of interesting as you're talking about that. Like, I'm thinking about it in aquarium, having an aquarium in your home is actually kind of akin, maybe time-wise, to preparing an extra meal a day versus a puppy, for example, which is more like having a child. I mean, I remember when my dog was a puppy, and particularly at the time we didn't have children, so the new puppy we get will probably get a little less attention than that puppy, but certainly as a new puppy owner, it was like, why is he making that noise? Does he need to go to the bathroom? 25 times a day we would take him out.
Yeah.
Make sure he has enough food, water continuously. Aquarium's not quite that level of commitment by any stretch. So.
No, they're not that level.
No, we actually did get a puppy, and you're exactly right, because that puppy consumed most of the time for the first 6 months that we had it during COVID. It was good and bad because it's a great dog. I wouldn't trade it for anything. But in terms of time consumption, the puppy consumed and still consumes significantly more than my tanks do. And I mean, I have 8 tanks set up right now, and the puppy still consumes more time.
So
The other thing that shifted, right? I mean, you're in the hardware business. And so most people in the hardware business saw probably an increase in hardware sales because people are now either setting up tanks or upgrading because they're seeing their tanks all the time.
and they have time.
Right? And they have time. But then on the flip side, air travel stopped. Right? Cargo became expensive. The availability of stuff that you could put in the tank actually decreased. So the dynamic went the opposite way. Normally you're mostly interested in corals and in stocking your tanks, but now those became difficult to get.
Well, anything
So that-
wild.
Yeah.
You've seen a shift,
Right.
like almost completely to aquacultured coral during COVID, because air travel from the islands or anywhere else was way down. Plus, Fiji was shut down for the first 6 months of COVID, or Fiji has been shut down. Indo was shut down for the first 6 months of COVID. So the availability.
Hawaii is completely shut down.
Yeah, Hawaii's completely
That's
shut
not
down.
COVID
That's
related.
fish,
though.
though.
That's not COVID
That's fish.
related.
That's not coral related, but still.
It's not
But
COVID
it's roughly timing
So
wise
you've
was very
seen the
similar there,
paradigm shift from wild to aquaculture. So potentially, what's that going to mean in the future? Are people going to go toward more? Because in seeing people and talking with people, named coral is what everybody wants. And if you don't have a name on a coral, people won't buy it. Well, this isn't named, I don't want it, which I don't understand, because a coral is a coral. If it's going to be beautiful, named or unnamed, they've sort of lost their way in that they want a named coral versus a beautiful coral. Because some of the named corals are not as nice as some of the unnamed corals.
We were actually just joking about this before, related to fish too. I've always been a huge proponent and lover of yellow tangs, and I always thought that should be one of the most expensive fish in the hobby because it is so beautiful. Now, obviously, prior to Hawaii being shut down, they were very common, but now, incidentally, now that they're getting rare, the price is rising because people really love that fish. And it's exactly the same. There's an element of rarity, but then there's also an element of how beautiful a coral is that fits into the pricing. And like you said, sometimes the more common ones are actually some of the more beautiful ones.
Yeah.
And fortunately, those are often fairly common, especially in times of shortage. So it's good for people getting in.
Well, that's also sort of what I've seen in that when I look online at a lot of the pictures of the tanks, a lot of the tanks are just a tank full of frags that grow. As soon as they grow to anything big, people cut them down. Versus him and I love big coral colonies that you can see from across the room. I can't really tell what a frag's going to look like until it turns into the big full-size colony. Because a frag is the fastest growing part. It's all colorful, but then when it grows into a full colony, some of them are beautiful, some of them are like, what the heck did I put this in my tank for?
Yeah, you don't see those colors
point.
in the larger colonies. that you see in the
Sometimes you
frags.
see richer
Yeah, you
colors
see
in other
different.
ways.
Yeah, there's differences.
But the difference is also what your perspective is. Do you want to sit in a chair 5-6 feet away from your tank and enjoy the full look of the tank, or do you want to sit this close and look at the frags? I prefer to sit 5 or 6 feet back, see the fish swimming around, see more natural behaviors and things like that. Because as one of the things we've been talking about is we also have both added freshwater tanks during COVID, and I'm enjoying it as much as I am the reef tank, in that it's not just a fish tank anymore. Now there's plants that are doing well. I have shrimp, I have weird snails, I have weird shrimp in there. There's actually lots to see in the tank that I wouldn't have done if I had done a planted tank in the past that wasn't, if not using what I learned with reef tanks. There's a lot more to a reef tank than just fish and corals. Having the snails, having the urchins, having all the microfauna and everything else, you see a lot of interesting things going on. That's what I've tried to do in the planted tanks as well. So that's something else that I learned during this, is to enjoy the little small things. Like one of the things we were talking about is we both have small ornamental shrimp in our planted tanks. But the crazy thing is when they have babies, they are literally the smallest things we have ever seen that can move around in the tank, that we know what it is, but it's just so small. You're just, how in the hell does this thing even survive in this tank?
So I think going back to kind of the original topic, I mean, I think that that's something that we see from the equipment side as well, is that I think there's the level of sophistication, when I say that not in terms of complexity, but I think one of the things we're seeing in the hobby is that people's expectations for the equipment, the outcome of their aquarium, how attractive it looks in their home, and basically how much time is required is diminishing in combination with those things. So we're seeing higher level of sophistication, higher demands on reliability and ongoing equipment function. And then, we're seeing a higher level expectation of result with less energy or time, right?
You should see that with the reef hobby too. I mean, that's the one way to make the hobby more popular, I think.
Is make it easier.
Is make it easier.
Yeah, make it easier.
I mean, we made it difficult
less
for
trial
people.
and error. Because
We made
when we
it very
started,
difficult for people.
yeah, when we started, it was all trial and error. Now you have a baseline. Okay, you do this, you do a water change, you have this much light, you have this much flow, you have this much. It's pretty simple.
Right.
I mean, if you start
Probability
off
of success is much higher.
much
higher than it ever was,
for sure.
which may account for why fewer people were leaving compared with in early days, where probably 60% of the people lasted a year and were out. It's more expensive now, particularly if you buy crazy named corals, but it doesn't have to be. It all depends on what your level of your pain threshold is for spending. You can have a beautiful tank and have named corals, but they could be a red planet and a PC rainbow, and those can be spectacular corals in your tank.
I think there's a difference in the hobbyists with respect to that, though, because I think there's a good chunk of the hobby that really likes beautiful grown-in reef tanks, because, for instance, that's what we as a company really like. I mean, that's what I personally like. And when we're showcasing what can be accomplished, it's the experience of creating a reef, granted totally unnatural because it's coral from all over the world and fish from all over the world.
Right.
But it's basically like seeing it, and then you see all these different animal interactions. And I mean, like, I love all the small inverts, like the sand sifters and all the different snails, like the creepy bumblebee ones that all congregate at night, and then
The nefarious snails.
the nefarious snails that come up out.
Come on.
I mean, it's such a wonderful thing to be a part of. So I think there's definitely the people who love that in the hobby, and then I think there's another component of the hobby who it satisfies a collection urge, where I'd say there's like the gardeners and the collectors, right? The collectors want rare sticks, the rarest, the most named, the most identifiable sticks, and they love that, and they grow them out and they share them and they buy them and they sell them. And then there's the people who are more interested in seeing that whole thing develop. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of crossover, but I think there is some separation there. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know, it's a complete separation, right? Because people like me and him, yeah, sure.
Bit
I
of
mean, I
both,
like corals.
yeah.
I do both, right?
Yeah.
Not collecting corals for the sake of collecting corals, right? But at the same time,
Seeing how
it's not like I have 5 corals in my tank, right? It's a 500-gallon tank.
Yeah.
It's going to have a lot of corals.
corals, yeah.
So there is some aspect of, quote, collecting. But at the same, also, it's not that big that I can get everything I want in there. So there's also this choosing of what I want to put in there, right? So that's where the collection aspect does come into play a little bit.
And there's the challenge aspect too, right? I mean, I remember
Right.
this. It's
Yeah.
like when you start out, it's like you want stuff that grows fast and fills it in that you can feel successful with. And then as you get more experience, you're like, why did I put that in my tank? Like, I can't get rid of it now. And then the next time around, you're like, okay, none of that.
No more green star polyps.
No more Pussyloporas.
No more xenia anymore, right?
Yeah, no more
because
xenia.
they do take over.
I mean,
But at
you
the
can have
same
a
time,
beautiful tank.
You can have a beautiful tank with exactly those things.
See, if I was going to do one more tank, I've sworn I'm not doing another tank, the 500 or less tank. But
Famous last words.
If I was
You
going
heard
to
it
do
here,
one more
everybody.
tank, I would do a 300-gallon tank, and it would have 3 huge colonies of different corals with a school of Anthias and a school of Chromis, and that would be it. I would want it to look like the videos that we always see of these fish darting in and out of the coral heads.
That's Sipidan. We dove there years ago, and that's exactly, as far as the eye can see, one type of coral and huge schools of Chromis and Anthias. and it's just absolutely stunning.
Yeah, I
amazing.
was looking at some videos this weekend, and it was just, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I set up a tank like that? One, it's not my nature because I always like to experiment. But whenever they had Mackin in Pittsburgh, it was probably like 15 years ago, and a couple of the European aquarists came in and they looked at my tank and they go, "It's very beautiful, but you have too many corals. You have too many different types."
Collectionitis.
Yeah,
I do it too. I like to grow.
I
but
prefer hoarder myself than a collector. But I would set up that tank, and I know it would be as spectacular as the tank with the 50 different coral colonies in it, but I think that would be more natural. And sadly, I've not seen anyone do that. I mean, I would have a big table coral, I would have a big staghorn, and I would have some kind of big bushy coral, and that would be it. But they would be big colonies or multiple colonies.
That just takes so much willpower. You have to resist the urge to fill it with other stuff.
Well, when you look at some of these planted tanks, people do a great job with the themed planted tanks.
Yeah.
I don't think that's crept into the hobby yet. So if you want to talk about where it's going to head, maybe there's room for that.
Yeah.
To do that. Right?
Could be the pioneer.
Well,
that's true.
I have a pinball machine that if I sell the pinball machine, I may have convinced my wife that I could put the 300 there, but I got to make.
So we went from I'm not doing any more tanks to I already have a plan.
Not even a small one, a 300-gallon.
When you have a 500,
that wasn't even 2 minutes.
When you've had a 300 and a 1200, or when you've had a 500 and a 1200, a 300's peanuts. No, this will take a lot of convincing. It's cost me houses and cars to get fish tanks in the past, so I don't know what this will cost me, but she never watches these videos.
So it's not actually your company that keeps the hobby going. Like it's, I gotcha. No, I mean, so that's another point. So higher expectations for equipment, higher expectations for success. Possibly theme tanks or somewhere we might go.
Theme tanks may have potential.
Yeah,
we see a lot more of them in. I mean, there's a lot more of these small private aquariums and stuff, semi-public aquariums and fish rooms springing up, and you're seeing more and more of that. And part of it, I think, actually comes to the fact that it's easier to keep tanks because it's certainly true in the coral spawning area where they've learned so much from the aquarium hobby. That now it's actually easier to do public exhibits and to do coral spawning because of the fact that the hobby has actually driven that kind of know-how and that equipment and whatnot forward.
Yeah, the stuff that Jamie Craigs is doing is amazing, but he basically learned from the hobby. I mean, he gives us all a lot of credit for coming down with the husbandry techniques and everything else, and then he refined it and utilized what we learned to make it even significantly better, obviously. But his goal is and Sanjay and I have talked about this, is to get our corals to start spawning in our own tanks.
That's what they do.
Yeah.
We just don't know sometimes.
No.
I mean, I've seen eggs in them all the time.
Yeah, when you break off the branches and you see
there's a good chance.
So then they're probably spawning.
Yeah, I have spawned at night somewhere and I'm asleep, not taking care of.
Yeah, and this also gets back to him having big colonies because there's a certain size aspect. That was the first thing that Jamie worked on, was at what size do you need a colony to be so it can successfully spawn.
So they spawn. I mean, you see a lot of stories from people where corals have spawned. But I think the key is to be able to make them spawn in queue and repeatable, right?
And the raise,
all the variability in the tank. They don't probably spawn the right time. They don't have the right conditions.
They don't have a place to settle. They get overgrown by algae. I mean, because he's breeding baby urchins that will consume the algae around the planula when they're doing. I mean, he's got it down to an exact science. Versus this would be more trial and error. But I think once people start seeing more spawning and get more successful at it.
And it gets easier again.
Yeah. Then you get true designer corals.
Then you get true designers. Then you can have.
Then you can have the real Paletta pink tip. Not this fake one you collect in the wild.
Not somebody named one that you actually.
Somebody named it after him.
No, maybe that's what we'll go back to too.
To increase the price of it.
Well, it's true, right? I mean, look at ball pythons, right? I mean, that's one that's. The ball pythons that people breed are absolutely insane because they're like F12 of they have like stripes practically. Some of them some of them are perfectly white, just insane. And I mean we could see the same thing in corals for sure.
Yeah. Just like Jamie's hybridizing to get the ones that will tolerate heat and things like that.
Yeah, we do it for color.
Yeah,
we do it for color. Because I mean, he's shown somewhere he's split or he's combined the planula 2 and 4.
He didn't combine. They combine themselves.
They combine themselves, but half the coral's purple, the other half is white.
They create a chimera.
Yeah, I mean, just some gorgeous things
great word.
that as we get better at it. So I mean, there's a lot of things positive of what's going to happen in the future. I mean, I remember I gave a talk in 1999 about the future of the hobby because things were shutting down, legislation was starting to go, and everyone was thinking it was the end of the hobby. And I was thinking, this typically manifests itself by people getting better at what they're doing rather than we're just throwing in the towel. And that's in fact what's happened over the last 20 years. People have gotten significantly better.
Not just better. I think if you take the time you were spending on just keeping systems going, right, and keeping the equipment going, you don't have time to fool around with other things. Well, right? It's like breeding clownfish. If you have to do all the steps from raising the phytoplankton to raising the rotifers, it's a lot more complicated.
Than now where you can just get all the stuff.
Just get all the stuff and just have to raise the babies. It's a lot easier, right? So I think we need to get to that point where supporting the effort that we put into it is made easy so we can then concentrate on what's more important in progressing things.
Right.
Right.
And I mean, and to your point too, just about, I mean, for instance, obviously like captive, bred, raised, and then further, I mean, you go from sexual production and then back to asexual production, obviously, once you grow the colonies up. But I mean, clearly, so many of the larger retailers at this point now all have coral farms basically to grow it out. And what comes out of those is just so much more tank hardy as well.
Yeah.
Plus, it's already colored up. It's
and
used
it's
to the environment.
also pest-free for the most
part.
part.
Pest-free for the most part.
Him and I have both seen over the years stranger pests and more problems. Like there's a lot more problems with dinoflagellates and cyanobacteria than we ever saw early on. Everybody seems to have it, and the question is why. I don't have an answer. I'd love to say this is why, but the more we learn, the better we get at things, the more things may regress and have problems.
Well, but that's kind of indicative, though, of any kind of like horticulture or husbandry activity. Is as you breed more specialized for one thing, you tend to expose yourself to other issues. So it's almost indicative of the fact that we now have so much coral that does come straight from tanks and gets spread around between tanks and systems like that. So the pests get hardier, and the ones that really thrive in our environment, in aquarium environments, are the ones that start to proliferate.
Well, it actually may be a result of your lights being better because the water is typically cooler and the dinoflagellates typically don't live well over 80 degrees, where before in the summer we would tend to wipe them out when we had the halides on in the summer. By the same token, we're getting more RTN, STN, which typically doesn't tolerate cooler temperatures. So there's pluses and minuses on things.
Interesting. Yeah, so I mean, lots of good stuff to look forward to. I mean, I think
lots of stuff we're going to need to learn and get better at.
That's the fun thing about this hobby. Learning never stops.
It never stops.
It never stops. I mean, I've been doing it for what, 30 years now? I've known Mike for 30 years.
Yeah.
So
I've been doing it for
30 years. You know more about the hobby or Mike?
I've been doing it for 37. We both admit we're still learning. We learn from each other and we learn from everybody else that we talk to. And that's one of the nice things. We do talk to a lot of people and you always learn something. It may be something simple, but sometimes those little simple things you learn make a big difference.
Very true. All right, well, I think that's probably a good place to cut this. We've had some interesting perspectives on what's going forward in the hobby, and I think we can all kind of agree that whatever it is, I'm sure it'll be very interesting and exciting.
Yeah, that's a great and exciting hobby to stay in.
We just hope we're around for another 31 years doing this. We'll be in our 90s, Sanjay. That'll be funny.
I don't know. I haven't been able to convince any of my kids to do it.
Me either. But we'll have a driver that take us on our road trips. We'll afford a driver that'll come and take.
Self-driven cars. Come on.
Oh, that's right. In 30 years.
We don't need that.
Flying self-driven cars.
Maybe flying.
There we go. Flying self-driven cars in 30 years.
Less time to come to these.
Yeah. As long as you're still here, we'll still come visit.
It'll be.
I appreciate that.
It'll be easier to fly my flying car here and pick up a spare part than worry about anything else. It'll be faster than having it shipped.
You never know where you're going with this, do you?
No, thank you guys. Always much appreciated.